it was actually my parents that helped me get into rowing. I was born in Canada, but actually did a lot of my growing up in Florida. And when we moved back to Canada right before I went into grade 8, I was not overly pleased to have had, my life picked up and shifted across countries, being an angsty teenager. And so my parents were looking for a friend group, some kind of a sport, something to help me ground our new life in Canada. And they reached out to a family friend who was helping coach the high school team for rowing in London, and said, please see if she'll maybe try this sport. And he came over and said, hey, like, you're pretty tall, like, are you interested in trying rowing? And honestly, I didn't really know what it was, but I was like, sure, why not? And my dad and I went down to Fanshawe Lake, and Bob Ward, my first coach, taught me how to use the rowing machine and put me out in a tub single. And that was it. It just sort of stuck, and I really enjoyed it. And being out in the water was cool. So it just kept going from there 18 years ago.
How peaceful, as much as training is not easy and training is usually early, how peaceful can it be when you get out in the middle of the water?
It can be quite beautiful. I think I sometimes forget those moments. I'm often reminded when I show someone a video of us rowing, and they're like, oh, wow, like the background is so beautiful. Like the place you row is gorgeous. And I was like, oh yeah, it is really quite nice. I'm just so dialed in most of the time. And so when I sit back and take a moment on days when the water is particularly flat and the sunrise is coming up in, a gorgeous way, there's definitely this air of silence that sort of hits you from time to time when you take a break and you're just sitting there and have a moment of realizing, like, wow, I'm in the middle of the lake and it's quiet and it's gorgeous and surrounded by nature. So there's definitely serene moments that come. And I'm glad you reminded me of that, because it's easy to forget those moments when you're encircled in pain.
Okay, well, let's start to move toward the encirclement of pain and the pain cave, I guess you guys talk about, and all those but what it takes to accomplish what you were able to do. Susanne Grainger joining us, born in London, grew up in Florida, part of Canada's gold medal winning women's 8 in Tokyo. So the heat, you wind up in a heat with New Zealand. New Zealand, always great competition. That first heat was so close, and they edge you out just by a little tiny smidge. I don't know if it's the number of the boat that got across first. I don't even know if it was that much. Take us through what it was like to come through the heat and not get the victory.
New Zealand came in being the reigning world champs. So they were definitely a crew to beat. We knew they were going to be competition. It was tough to know what to expect, I think, for most countries. With COVID, a lot of our racing had been canceled, and so we hadn't actually raced internationally in 2 years. And so lining up on the start line, you didn't really know what to expect. And so we could only focus on having our best race as a boat internally, and seeing where that stacked us up. And New Zealand was one of the only crews that were doubling. So their women's pair was also racing in their women's 8. And so had they lost the heat, they would have actually had to race the rep and race more races than they want, with the other women's pair having to race again too. So they had to win that. And not that we didn't, because we obviously wanted to win, but I think having that extra level of desperation really helped them push across the finish line at that last moment. And there were things in our boat too that we didn't execute as well as we could have in that first race. We're a fairly new boat. That was actually the second official 2-kilometer race that we had done as a crew, as a whole crew. So it was new for us to all be together. And so we were proud to be able to be only, less than a second off the reigning world champs. And so I think after the heat, we were bummed to not win, because we're competitive. We want to win, and it's exciting to cross the finish line first. But we spun it and said, this is actually an opportunity for us to have another race as an 8 before we go into the final, to really hone in on what we want to change and what we want to get better at. So it was a bummer not to cross the finish line first, but I think in the long run, it was actually a positive for us.
puts you into the repechage. New Zealand did not have to go there. The United States did not have to go there. The race in the repechage, how do you remember it?
That was a wild day. It was crazy windy on the race course that day, a ripping tailwind. So it really pushes you along, but it can make rowing cleanly without catching water or getting your blade stuck quite difficult. And so we really focused that day on going into racing with composure. We had talked about what we wanted to change from the heat and how we wanted to improve. So we had goals in our own mind. We had to come top 4 in that race, so essentially not last, to make it to the A final. And so our goal was to win the race and make a statement, but it was ultimately also to make the A final. And so it was such a weird mix of feelings to cross the finish line in second behind Romania, yet still have broken the previous world record and had set a Canadian record for the fastest women's 8. So it was a weird mix of emotions of being so bummed that they edged us out by like 0.35 of a second. We were so close, but at the same time, it's the fastest I had ever gone in a women's 8, the fastest Canada had ever gone in a women's 8, and still faster than the previous world record. So it was crazy exciting. And we did execute things in our rep better than we had in the heat. There were still parts of that race that we even wanted to change from that, but we felt that it was a step up from our previous race and that we were making progress, and we kept our composure and made it across the finish line in the place that we needed to get to the ultimate race.
We're talking with Susanne Grainger, 5th seat in the women's 8, gold medalist from Tokyo. Okay, let's go to the gold medal race. Help us understand this. You're in lane 2. You're beside the defending world champions in New Zealand, the boat that had beaten you by just this much in the heat. Lane 2, good lane to be in beside the reigning world champions, good place to be, or is it not necessarily a great spot to be?
It can really depend on the wind conditions. In flat conditions, you want to be in the middle lane, so right in the center, so lane 3, usually lane 3 or 4, to be able to have boats on both sides, so you feel like you're in the middle of the competition. Being in lane 2, we felt a little bit separated from things that were going on. I'm a port, so when I row, I face out to the right, and so I was lucky enough when I faced out. No one's supposed to look out of the boat, but in your peripheral, I would at least have boats on my side that I could see. But if you were starboard and you faced out to the left, you only have one boat that you would have any visual of, and so it can feel very separated. In the final, though, we did decide to be very heads in, and we were going to remain very focused and not look out of the boat at all. So I don't think it ultimately mattered. But if it's a flat conditions, you want to be in the middle lane with everybody around you.
Well, you start and you appeared to get a tremendous start, because it wasn't just that smidge that you were out. You had a couple meter lead almost right off the bat. Was that part of the strategy going into the race?
Absolutely. We did a lot of practice starts on Elk Lake here in Victoria. We knew that we could be a fast starting crew. We had seen some impressive times in training, and so one of the things that we wanted to execute was a stellar start. We wanted to blast out of the gates, and we knew that the world was going to come with us. Everybody tries something different at the Olympics, and so we wanted to do what we knew we could and stick within our realm of capability and trust our fitness.
So you hit 500 meters, the lead grows a little bit, a few more meters ahead. You hit 1,000, few more meters ahead. You hit 1,500 meters. The last 500 meters of an event like this, because the women's 8 is known as a sprint, even though it's 2,000 meters, you're full out the whole time. What is the last 500 meters like in a race like that? How much does it hurt? What does it feel like? Is there a way to describe it?
It's hard to describe what you feel at a point in a race. Rowing, I think, for me personally, the only free strokes in a race are probably the first 15 to 20 out of the start, that you can do as hard as you want, as fast as you want, and you won't pay for it later. And so we knew that we had the fitness to go out as hard as we could at the beginning and be able to hold it, as long as we rode and stayed together. And so going into the last 1,500 meters of a race like that, you've been in pain already, probably from after the first 30 seconds of the race, it really starts to set in. But going through that last 500 is where your brain starts telling you, this is very painful, please stop. And you sort of just shut that voice off and say, no, we're fine, we're going to keep going. But when you do that, I start to experience tunnel vision. So my peripheral sort of will go black. My hearing gets really fuzzy. It almost feels like the ears are plugged. And you can't really pinpoint exactly what hurts. It's sort of this like abyss of full body pain. It's like when you've done a bunch of squats or you've walked up the stairs a million times and you get that burn in your legs. That's sort of all over in your body saying, please let me relax. And at this point, you've probably gotten pretty close to your max heart rate. So there's a lot going on. And I think that's why it's so important in the women's 8 to trust your coxswain. She's our fearless leader. She sits up there in the front and tells us what to do and steers the boat and keeps us on track. So going through that last 1,500 meter mark, she kept saying, stay with me, because we'd, watched previous racing and we saw that focus was really the big game changer for people at this part in the race. If you look at the boat and you get distracted, you're not moving as well as you should. And that can be that 0.35, 0.32 of a second that takes it for you. I mean, these races are obviously won by inches. So you're in a lot of pain at that point. And I think we'd learned from our previous 2 races that if 500 meters to go, nothing is decided. And so even though we had that lead, we wanted more. And so our coxswain actually said, like, never again, not enough. Like, we are going to keep moving. We're going to make a statement. This is where we go. And so it was a painful moment, but honestly, we always joke that if you're winning, it hurts less, which it doesn't necessarily hurt less, but you really feed off of that motivation of seeing boats behind you. And so it's an experience, but I mean, you cross the finish line and pain is temporary. So you push through it.
When you cross the finish line, how do you know in rowing that you've won? Because like you say, some of you aren't seeing all of the boats. You were trying to not look outside of the boat. How do you find out it's over and you've won gold?
That's another thing our coxswain is really important for. She will, in order for us to keep our heads in the boat, she lets us know where we are in a race. So one of the ways we know is from her. In this race, she, in our last 10 strokes, said to us, you are going to be Olympic champions. And I remember not really being able to process what she said between the pain and the shock of that statement and thinking, oh my gosh, like, seriously, is this real? And crossing the finish line, I think as we crossed the finish line, she was out of her seat and screaming and yelling, and everyone was, so excited and so much shock and pain all at the same time. But you hear there's a buzzer at the finish line, like a big air horn that goes off so that you know that you've crossed. And a lot of the times I won't hear it because of tunnel vision and being in pain, but that's the one sound that you definitely listen for when you get to that point. But they also have a board that goes up near the finish line that will list the ranking that you've crossed the finish line in. And that's particularly helpful, especially if there's a photo finish, so you can eventually see like what you did place. And I remember looking at the board so many times to check to see that our name was actually listed as number 1, and being so surprised, because as an athlete, visualization is so important. And so we've visualized crossing the finish line. We've visualized seeing ourselves in first, and to have it happen in real life was so incredible, but almost unbelievable, because that's the moment you've dreamed of. And so when you actually get there, it's so surreal. And so I actually said to the woman in front of me, Madison, she turned around and looked at me with this unbelievably blank stare. And I was like, Madison, like, that's our name in first, like, we're on the board, we did it, this is real. And so it was a pretty cool moment to be able to turn and look up there and say, I didn't just dream that, it's actually happening.